My name is Silvia Hutchins. I've been a member of UUCV for about 10 years, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Bobbie Schoenherr, who is one of our original members of our church and a dearly beloved elder. Morning, Bobbie.
Good morning.
I have a couple of questions for you. Bobbie, when and how was it decided to start a UU church in Ventura?
Well, it's my understanding that a group of people who were going to the Universalist Church in Santa Paula wanted to come over here. The minister had been relieved from his position there, and he suggested that maybe a church could be started. There were about 15 families at that time living in Ventura that were going to the Universalist Church, and most of them had been members of Unitarian churches before coming to Ventura. Now, in perspective, we need to understand that Ventura only had 30,000 people in it at that time, so it was a small community.
Yeah.
But that's how it started. They got together, they planned in the spring of 1958. Now, my husband and I moved up here in June of 1958, and all summer I was here not knowing what was going on. I'd heard there was a fellowship that was very small, but they didn't meet. So in September, I happened to look at the local paper, and here was an ad that a Universalist church was going to start, a Universalist Unitarian church was going to start in Ventura, and they were going to start meeting at night at the Alice Bartlett home. So that the first, in September, around the 18th, 19th of September, the Sunday evening, we met for the first time. And when we had our 30th anniversary, Fred Lashane, who was the minister, brought his order of service, and he'd written down how many people were there that night, and there were 63 people, if I recall correctly. So that was the beginning.
That's pretty exciting. And had you had experience before?
Oh yes, my husband and I had become Unitarians in Miami, Florida in 1952, and that's what we found, and that was where we knew that was going to be our faith from that point on.
Uh-huh. And what are some of your earliest or fondest memories of the church as it was starting?
Well, the first 2 years were pretty rough because Fred had a family of 4 children. Financially, we were having problems to pay him, and we were meeting at the Billy Clower House, which was a dance studio here in Ventura. And it was a group was called at John Quinn's house. He was president, and where they met and kind of talked about whether or not we could afford to keep Fred. And this group decided that we couldn't, so a congregational meeting was called, and some people were very surprised and shocked, but we really weren't coming up with the money. So we did let Fred go. But then we kind of were a fellowship for a few months, and then in 1961 we called Ron Cook, and I believe by that time Art Stoddard was our president. And Ron came and we were very fortunate because in 1960 there was a house on Main Street across from Ventura High School called the Mosier Home, the old Mosier Home, and it had been rented by the Democrats in the fall, and it was still there for rent. So we were able to rent it, and so when Ron came, we had a building to work in.
Oh, exciting.
And he was with us for 5 years.
And what types of activities was the church involved in at first?
Well, until we moved into the Mosier house, we didn't do a whole lot other than just meet for services on Sunday. We met in people's homes. We really got acquainted with one another because we were all new to the community. So, but when we started moving in the Mosier home, we started having dances and spaghetti feeds and Christmas programs, Easter. And we had what were they called? It was a group of players that came down and presented plays. And then we also had nights of forums where we had I'm trying to remember some of the groups. We had the John Birch Society one night. We had what was the group of, not Malcolm X, but it was the group that was the black militants. We had them one night. And just different groups of forums that we had to speak of all rainbows. And in addition to dinners and this type of thing. And that was what we could do while we were at the Mosier home for a couple of years. Then after that, we met in several places, but we couldn't have church school because there was no place. Now, when we were meeting, before we went to the Mosier home, when we were at the Billy Clower house, actually the preschoolers met in one place, the teenagers met in another place, and the adults met at another place. So it was kind of a lot of traveling. But when we were in the Mosier home, we were all together. And then they were, again, another year or two, the children couldn't have a school. But then, and my husband and I were gone during this very short period, but they managed to rent what was called the YMCA, which was the Old Mound School on Telegraph. And then there, again, they were able to start up church school and have a full program. And then in 1966, when my husband and I came back from Porterville, Ron had decided to leave after 5 years. So this was kind of a shock to us because we had kept in touch with him. We had bought a little house down here, and I commuted a lot back and forth and never really lost track. And then in the Y, there were a lot of activities, but not like we could in the Mosier home because it was, it was a Y and they had other activities during the week.
Were there any other issues that you think were important during that time period besides finances?
Well, if I recall, during the time Ron was here, we were doing pretty well. We had a women's auxiliary group that had raised some money, and the old the group that had been meeting here, the fellowship, gave us $600 towards a building fund, and that kind of spurred us. And then the women's auxiliary raised money, and I think we had $2,500 or something like that. So the thought of having a building was with us almost from the beginning. It just took us a long time to get there, but it was always in the back of our mind, at least some of us.
Right. Well, time has passed and the church has evolved and grown. In what ways do you think the character of the church has changed?
It's a much more compassionate church, much more accepting. People can have different ideas and be accepted and not ridiculed. I guess some of us felt like it was only in our group that this was going on, but I've since kind of discovered, I think, the Unitarian Universalists across the country, I think, were going through some changes during the 70s. We had a minister that really almost destroyed our church and from his behavior. And we had a bad reputation for a long time. But then in '80, we brought in Frederica Lee as our minister, and while she was here, we developed more compassion, at least outwardly. but not, it was still not there entirely. People still were kind of critical of someone who said they were a Christian Unitarian or something else. So it was a process during the 80s and 90s. But then in 1968, Frank Peterson had quietly sat back for 10 years observing all this and came up with an idea on how we could have a building. And there had been a home up on Telegraph and Day Road that we had been looking at for a long time, called what we call later the Terry House, but at that time we referred to as the Day Street Road house. And Frank came up with the idea that if 15 families donated $1,000 each, we could have the down payment. So in 1968, that's what we did. We raised the money and put a down payment on the Terry House. And it was $60,000. It had been $40,000, but it was $60,000 when we bought it. And that's how we finally got into a building. And of course then we really had a lot of activities. Mm-hmm. Thanksgiving dinners and a lot of things.
And the children had their space?
Yes, and the children for a long time it wasn't very good. It was in the basement. But there was a time later on that a couple donated enough money that we were able to renovate the basement and remodel it. Mm-hmm. As it happened, it was not long before after that we bought a bigger building, but we had lived with it for a long, long time.
Ah. And what would you say, what would you say now about establishing a church that you didn't know back then?
Support from the denomination. But on the other hand, I don't know how much support we would have gotten, because my understanding in later years was that Fred had upset people, the minister that started us, mm-hmm. and I guess the members that left Santa Paula upset people. So I guess there was a long time that as a congregation we weren't appreciated. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we had to kind of live that down. But I would definitely say no group should start without some help. Mm-hmm. But I also think the association did a lot of maturing at that time, particularly during the 70s. Mm-hmm. A lot of things changed. It was during that time or a little later that the principles were developed. Because we were...
7 principles.
Yes, the 7 principles. Because we were always discussing and maybe arguing about what we believed. Mm-hmm. And there was no real agreement for people. Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel it's important that people learn a little bit about our background as Unitarians, that we were basically a Christian-based church. I know we've pulled away from that, but there are people who still are Christian Unitarians. Mm-hmm. They are not accepted in the mainstream Christian churches because they don't believe a lot of the things that they are supposed to believe in those churches, but they still consider themselves followers of Jesus. I think they need to be respected. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it was a long time before a lot of people in our congregation began to accept the differences. I mean, I would hear people say something that was rather insulting, mm-hmm. about, well, when this church believed this, or, some people came in with the idea that no one was a believer of Jesus, or, they were humanists with a capital H, because if you were a humanist, you couldn't follow Jesus' teachings. You had to be an atheist. Mm-hmm. Well, I never felt that way. I felt a humanist is a person who cares about other people. And to me, Jesus was basically a humanist. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's my identification of a humanist. Mm-hmm. So when Jan came, I remember her one sermon, she referred to humanist with a capital H and a humanist with a small h. And I've always, after that, I thought, I wish I'd thought of that 20 years ago. You know.
Well, let's see. Once again, we're at a turning point in our church in the search for a new minister. And I'm wondering, what would be your hopes for our future?
You know, I really thought a lot about that. But at my age, I'm not sure. I think continued growth. We need children. We have a healthy youth program going. It needs to grow. Keep on top of what's going on in the community and continue supporting things in the community that we believe in, such as the homelessness, this type of thing. I think these are very important for us as a congregation. I think it makes us healthier. It makes us more sensitive. And don't get too involved in whether or not the building's going to be big enough or small enough or whatever. Over time, things will be there. Somebody's going to think of something, just like Frank did, that we need this at this time. But one of the things that I do hope that the future does, we went through a period where we had a capital gains where we collected about $200,000. But then the city came in and said if we built on the hill, we would have to help straighten out the road. Well, we knew we couldn't afford that, so the board decided that people could have their money back if they wanted it. But so about $100,000 was returned to members, but we still had the $100,000. And during the 90s, we went through a crunch again where people weren't supporting a church like they needed to. I'm just talking about everyday money, you know, paying the minister.
Right.
And they kept saying, well, we've got money we can pull out, you know, the building fund. Now, wait a minute, that building fund is there for the building, not to pay the minister, not to pay our bills. So that was a real struggle. So I hope the church never goes through that again. I hope it's always very clear that whatever money is put aside for something of the future, that's what it's for, not for expenses, everyday expenses. That would be one thing that I hope we've matured a little bit over that. But really, the church is in a good place now. And I really think that if it continues, new creative ideas are going to come up and it's going to take care of itself.
Sounds like words to the wise about finances. Why do you still attend UUCV? And in what ways is the church important to you?
Well, the church is very important to me because growing up, I went to every church that I could walk to. I mean, you know, wherever we lived close, I went. My parents didn't go to church. So I was exposed to a lot of different churches. And when my husband and I were married, both of us had attended the Congregationalist church. I when I was in high school and he a little later when he was a young adult. So we were married in the Congregationalist church. But somehow it didn't fit. There were things that when they were preached that I just didn't quite buy into. And we were in Miami. We had gone to Miami so that John could go to university there to get his master's degree. We were driving around the first weekend, and he said, we were looking and we saw the Unitarian church, First Unitarian. He said, would you like to go to church on Sunday? And I said, yeah, let's go. I had heard about Unitarianism in college when I was taking an American Lit course, and we studied Emerson, and the professor talked about Emerson being a minister, and I thought, gee, that sounds more like what I believe, not knowing that I was within 10 blocks of the Unitarian Church, the first Unitarian Church in Los Angeles. I lived very close to it, but had no idea that it was there. Never heard of it, really. So we went, and within 2 or 3 weeks, I think we joined. I mean, it was our church. We knew that was where we wanted to be. And, I mean, I can come to church on Sunday. I have a ride. I do miss not being able to come to the other activities. But as long as I'm alive and can, I need the stimulus at least once a week. So that's why and it's my beliefs. I mean, I've changed a lot. A lot of my ideas have changed over the years. I remember one time when I was at a GA in Connecticut at Yale. Gail Seavey was an student intern with us, and she would finish her year. And we were all having pizza afterwards, and that was when they brought up the gay, lesbian proposition, whatever it was. And I made the comment to her, it was the bisexual, I think, that was bothering people more than anything else. And I said, I have feelings. And she said, we all have feelings. It's where we take them that's important. And I've always remembered that.
Yeah.
People take their feelings the wrong way. I mean, they act out in a negative way against their feelings rather than sitting back and saying, but what's the right thing to do? Because what I have discovered is if I do the right thing, those feelings diminish. Those negative feelings, they get smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yes, they do. Is there anything that we have not discussed that you would like to mention or talk about?
Not really. I other than as far as the congregation is concerned, I hope they don't expect too much. I mean, every minister is different. Every minister has something to offer. Regardless of who they are, they all have something to offer. And some offer more than others, but you can learn from all of them.
We're hoping someone will become a historian. You used to be the historian
for
the church.
Yeah, well, I was picked. I didn't really volunteer to be historian. Frank,
isn't that how it happens?
David Frank just made me historian because my memory. But I did write what is in the computer. I mean, what you read, the history of the church when you pull it up. I did write the original part of that. It was edited a little later, and I went back and read to make sure that it was all still accurate, because in the beginning there was a time when people were saying that we were a part of the fellowship. We were never a part of the fellowship. The fellowship was here. We didn't go into that. The fellowship was here, but it was falling apart. In the very early 50s, 1951, when Joy and I were in Miami, the fellowship here was very active. It had people from Raytheon, and they had a church school going and everything, no minister, but it was a fellowship. But then they all moved.
I never even heard about a fellowship before.
Yeah, it was
church.
here. And so I think if you read what's on the computer, it goes into that a little bit. But we were separate from the fellowship. And the people that were members of the fellowship, still members, they were aware of this. And then Elizabeth Topping was one of the members of the fellowship. And I think she was behind our getting the $600 because she joined our church. And I was secretary with when Dave English was president, and I did the footwork on getting us incorporated. He wanted that done while he was president, and I went down and talked to Frank Orr, and Frank helped me with all the paperwork, and that's when we became. And then that was also about the time that we adopted, and my memory isn't real clear here. We adopted and we were moving to Porterville, so I think that's why I didn't go down to the county to sign the papers, but Elizabeth Topping did. So she became involved with us. She was in her 90s at that time.
Whoa.
Yeah, she was in her 90s at that time. So,
What a beautiful legacy.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's nice to know that the Elizabeth Topping room is in the library.
Uh-huh.
And Ron pointed this out to me one time. I think it was Ron. I believe he said that the librarian before her, Elizabeth Topping, then Catherine Chadwick, and then Dixie were all Unitarians, librarians,
Yeah.
the county librarians.
So what are you going to be, a teacher or a librarian?
But it's just interesting that they were all Unitarian in a
Yeah.
little town like this that was very conservative.
Yeah. Ah. Wow.
So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Thank you very much.